In the annals of history, the United States is often portrayed as a beacon of democracy and freedom, championing the fight against tyranny and oppression. However, beneath this veneer of righteousness lies a darker narrative, one that has been meticulously concealed from public scrutiny. During the turbulent years of the 20th century, amidst the chaos of global conflicts, the U.S. government sanctioned a series of covert experiments that defied ethical boundaries and human decency. The origins of these experiments can be traced back to World War II, a time when the quest for technological superiority overshadowed moral considerations. As the Allies faced the Axis powers, the U.S. embarked on a secretive endeavor known as Project Black Phoenix. This clandestine initiative aimed to develop biological and chemical weapons that could turn the tide of war. The project was spearheaded by a group of ambitious scientists and military officials operating under the guise of national security. One of the most notorious experiments conducted under Project Black Phoenix took place at Fort Detrick in Maryland. Officially, Fort Detrick was a center for biological research, but within its heavily guarded confines, a more sinister agenda unfolded. Under the direction of Dr. William Baxter, a leading microbiologist with a dubious ethical compass, the facility became a hub for testing deadly pathogens on unwitting subjects. The test subjects, often referred to as volunteers, in official documents were primarily prisoners, mental health patients, and marginalized individuals who had little means to resist or escape. These individuals were exposed to a variety of lethal agents, including anthrax, botulinum toxin, and plague bacteria. The objective was to study the effects of these pathogens on the human body and to develop countermeasures for potential biological warfare. Dr. Baxter's meticulous records, which were discovered decades later in a hidden archive, reveal the horrifying details of these experiments. Subjects were injected with the pathogens and observed in isolation chambers, where they suffered excruciating symptoms before succumbing to the diseases. The data collected from these grim experiments provided valuable insights into the virulence and transmission of the pathogens, but at an unimaginable human cost. As World War II gave way to the Cold War, the U.S. government's appetite for secretive and morally dubious experiments did not wane. The new geopolitical landscape, marked by the rivalry with the Soviet Union, fueled an era of unprecedented paranoia and technological competition. During this period, Project MKUltra emerged as one of the most infamous programs, spearheaded by the Central Intelligence Agency CIA. Project MKUltra, initially conceived to develop mind control techniques, quickly spiraled into a nightmarish web of psychological manipulation and human experimentation. Led by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the project aimed to explore the limits of human consciousness and the potential for controlling minds through drugs, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation. The experiments were conducted in secret facilities across the country, often without the consent or knowledge of the subjects. One of the darkest chapters of MKUltra involved the use of LSD, a powerful hallucinogenic drug, on unsuspecting individuals. In a series of experiments, codenamed Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, where sex workers lured clients who were then secretly dosed with LSD. The subjects, under the influence of the drug, were observed through hidden cameras, and their reactions were meticulously recorded. The documents unearthed from CIA archives revealed the extent of the psychological trauma inflicted on these individuals. Many of the subjects experienced severe paranoia, hallucinations, and long-term psychological damage. Some were driven to the brink of insanity, their lives forever altered by the experiments. Despite the obvious ethical violations, the CIA continued its pursuit, driven by the fear that the Soviets were conducting similar research. In another branch of MKUltra, known as Subproject 68, Dr. Ewan Cameron, a respected psychiatrist, conducted experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada. His methods, which included intensive electroconvulsive therapy, sensory deprivation, and forced drug-induced comas, were intended to depattern individuals, essentially wiping their minds clean. Cameron's goal was to rebuild the human psyche, but his brutal techniques left many subjects in a permanent state of cognitive disarray. The dawn of the atomic age brought with it a new realm of experimentation, as the U.S. government sought to understand and harness the power of nuclear energy. Amidst the development of nuclear weapons, a series of secret experiments known as the Atomic Energy Commission (AEC) human radiation experiments were conducted. These experiments aimed to study the effects of radiation on the human body, often without the informed consent of the subjects. One of the most egregious cases involved the injection of plutonium into unsuspecting patients at various hospitals across the United States. These patients, many of whom were terminally ill, were told they were receiving experimental treatments for their conditions. In reality, they were being used as human guinea pigs to study the long-term effects of radiation exposure. The records, which surfaced decades later, revealed that many of these individuals suffered severe health complications, including cancers and organ failure. Another disturbing episode occurred at the Fernald School in Massachusetts, where mentally disabled children were subjected to radiation experiments. Under the guise of a nutritional study, the children were fed radioactive isotopes in their food and milk. The researchers sought to understand how radiation was absorbed and processed by the human body, but the experiments left the children vulnerable to a host of health problems. The long-term consequences of these experiments remained hidden until investigative journalists uncovered the truth in the 1990s. The EAC also conducted numerous above-ground nuclear tests in the Nevada desert, often with little regard for the fallout's impact on nearby communities. Residents in towns downwind from the test sites, known as downwinders, were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, leading to increased rates of cancer and other illnesses. For years, the government denied any wrongdoing, attributing the health problems to other causes. It was only after persistent advocacy by affected communities that the truth began to emerge. The revelations about these wartime experiments and their aftermath have left an indelible mark on the American psyche. While some of these stories have trickled into the public domain, many details remain shrouded in secrecy, protected by government agencies and classified documents. The victims of these experiments and their families have struggled for recognition and justice, often facing insurmountable obstacles in their quest for accountability. The legacy of these experiments raises profound questions about the balance between scientific progress and ethical responsibility. The pursuit of knowledge, especially in times of war and national crisis, often led to the erosion of fundamental human rights. The stories of Fort Detrick, MK-Ultra, and the AEC human radiation experiments serve as grim reminders of the cost of unchecked ambition and the dangers of operating in the shadows. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to declassify government documents and bring greater transparency to these dark chapters of history. Advocacy groups and ethical watchdogs continue to push for comprehensive investigations and public acknowledgement of the victims' suffering. The U.S. government, while making some strides towards transparency, still faces criticism for its reluctance to fully disclose the extent of these experiments. The untold truths of America's wartime experiments challenge us to reflect on the ethical boundaries of scientific research and the responsibilities of those in power. As we uncover more of these hidden stories, we are reminded that the pursuit of progress must never come at the expense of humanity's core values. The ghosts of these experiments linger, urging us to learn from the past and to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. The government may continue to hide certain truths, but the resilience of those who seek justice ensures that the light of truth will eventually pierce the darkness. The legacy of these wartime experiments is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to seek truth, demand accountability, and uphold the principles of ethical conduct, even in the face of overwhelming odds. While many of the U.S. government's wartime experiments were buried deep within classified files, few were as shocking as the revelations surrounding Operation Phoenix. Initially sold to the public as a counterintelligence and psychological warfare program during the Vietnam War, the true nature of the project remained hidden for decades. It was only after several key whistleblowers came forward that the horrifying scope of the operation began to be understood. Operation Phoenix, overseen by the CIA and U.S. military intelligence, was far more than just an effort to gather intelligence on the Viet Cong. Deep within secret military installations, scientists conducted experiments on unwitting soldiers and civilians, attempting to unravel the mysteries of the human mind. The true goal? To find a way to break and reprogram the human psyche, creating obedient, unthinking soldiers and political assets that could be controlled with ease. These experiments ranged from sleep deprivation and electroshock therapy to mind-altering drugs like LSD and psilocybin. Soldiers were subjected to intense psychological torture, designed to fracture their sense of identity and reshape their consciousness into something more malleable. In some cases, entire personalities were erased, replaced by carefully programmed alter egos that responded only to specific commands. Perhaps most horrifying of all were the attempts to develop what some referred to as psychic warriors, building on the CIA's earlier work under Project MK-Ultra, the U.S. Government believed that certain individuals possessed latent psychic abilities, telepathy, remote viewing, and even telekinesis. These individuals were subjected to a grueling regimen of experiments designed to enhance their abilities. Whether or not these experiments succeeded remains a subject of heated debate, but the human cost was undeniable. Many of the subjects ended up in mental institutions, their minds irreparably damaged by the trauma they endured. Though the official narrative dismissed Operation Phoenix as a failure, some believe that the project was far more successful than the public was led to believe. If this is true, the implications are staggering. How many of these human sleeper agents were successfully deployed in the years that followed, their minds unknowingly enslaved to their handlers? And if so, how deeply have they infiltrated modern society? While Operation Phoenix focused on the manipulation of the mind, Project Sunshine sought to control an entirely different aspect of human existence, the very essence of life itself. In the aftermath of World War II, the U.S. government faced an unprecedented challenge. As they witnessed the destructive power of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they began to realize that the future of warfare would depend not just on bombs, but on controlling the fallout, both literal and metaphorical, of atomic energy. Enter Project Sunshine, a top-secret initiative conducted by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission in the late 1940s and 1950s. Officially, the project was designed to study the effects of radiation on the human body, particularly in the wake of nuclear detonations. However, what the public didn't know was that the research required a steady supply of human tissues, and the U.S. government wasn't particular about where they obtained these samples. In a chilling turn of events, government officials covertly harvested organs, bones, and tissue samples from thousands of dead individuals without the consent of their families. Many of these were the bodies of children, often stillborn or infants who had died soon after birth. The government sought out young tissue, believing it to be more susceptible to radiation and therefore more valuable for study. Project Sunshine extended its reach across the globe, with samples taken from hospitals, morgues, and funeral homes. Families of the deceased were never told the truth. Their loved ones were dissected and sent to secret laboratories, where scientists exposed the tissue to varying levels of radiation to study the long-term effects. These experiments were designed to understand how nuclear fallout would affect the population over time, but at a grave ethical cost. Even decades after Project Sunshine was officially ended, its legacy lives on in the unmarked graves of countless individuals whose bodies were used in secret radiation experiments. The revelations about the project were enough to shake public trust in the government, but insiders claim that the full extent of the experiments has never been revealed. How far did the government go in its quest to understand the impact of radiation on the human body? And what else were they willing to sacrifice in their pursuit of power? Another dark chapter in the history of U.S. wartime experiments was the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. While much has been written about the human rights abuses committed during this experiment, the true scope of the program and its far-reaching consequences remains largely untold. Beginning in 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service launched what they claimed was a study to observe the progression of untreated syphilis in African-American men in rural Alabama. The participants, all of whom were poor and uneducated, were never informed of their diagnosis. Instead, they were told they were being treated for bad blood, a vague term that masked the reality of their condition. The government deliberately withheld life-saving treatments, even after penicillin became widely available in the 1940s, ensuring that the men continued to suffer and die from the disease. What the public was not told, however, was that the Tuskegee study was not simply an exercise in racial discrimination and medical negligence. It was part of a broader program designed to explore the long-term effects of syphilis as a biological weapon. As the Cold War began to heat up, the U.S. government became increasingly interested in the potential use of biological agents in warfare, and syphilis, along with other infectious diseases, was at the top of the list. The Tuskegee study was seen as a real-time, human experiment that could provide valuable data on how the disease would spread in a controlled population over time. It was, in essence, a biological warfare test conducted on U.S. soil, using unsuspecting American citizens as lab rats. The study only ended in 1972 after a whistleblower exposed the program to the press, but by then, the damage had been done. Dozens of men had died, and many more were left with long-term health complications, including passing the disease on to their children and spouses. The scandal led to public outrage, and in 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology to the survivors and their families. But even then, the true scope of the government's intentions remained hidden. Many believe that the Tuskegee study was just one part of a larger, more insidious plan to test the effects of biological warfare on unsuspecting populations, both at home and abroad. While the Tuskegee syphilis study remains one of the most well-known wartime atrocities committed by the U.S. government, there is another, far more sinister operation that has been carefully buried beneath layers of classified documents and denials: Operation Paperclip. After World War II, as the Allied forces uncovered the full extent of Nazi Germany's war crimes, they were faced with a difficult decision. Many of the top Nazi scientists responsible for horrific human experiments during the Holocaust also possessed invaluable knowledge, particularly in the fields of rocketry, medicine, and biological warfare. Rather than face trial at Nuremberg, many of these scientists were secretly recruited by the U.S. government under the guise of national security. Operation Paperclip, as it came to be known, involved the covert relocation of more than 1,600 Nazi scientists to the United States, where they were integrated into American research programs. Men who had once overseen unspeakable human experimentation at concentration camps like Dachau and Auschwitz were given new identities, new lives, and positions of power within the U.S. military-industrial complex. Many of these scientists went on to work at prestigious institutions like NASA, where they played critical roles in the development of the U.S. space program. One of the most famous examples is Wernher von Braun, the Nazi rocket scientist who became the father of the American space race. But von Braun was not alone. Dozens of other scientists with equally dark pasts found their way into the upper echelons of American science, medicine, and technology. The ethical implications of Operation Paperclip were staggering. By welcoming these war criminals into the fold, the U.S. government effectively sanctioned the atrocities they had committed. Moreover, it allowed these scientists to continue their experiments on U.S. soil, albeit under a new banner. Many of the biological warfare programs developed during the Cold War, including the use of chemical agents like Agent Orange and VX gas, can trace their origins back to the Nazi scientists brought over in the wake of World War II. The legacy of Operation Paperclip is one of complicity and silence. To this day, the full extent of the program remains classified, with many of the scientists' true identities and past crimes carefully scrubbed from the historical record. But the truth remains buried in the pages of declassified documents, waiting for those brave enough to uncover it. As we look back on the U.S. government's wartime experiments, one thing becomes clear: the pursuit of power, knowledge, and domination came at a terrible cost, one that countless individuals unknowingly paid with their lives, their minds, and their dignity.